When were you sure you were about to die? I was teaching sophomore English when 3 loud pops echoed through the building and every kid in my classroom froze. That's when Principal Baxter came on the intercom with his fake cheerful voice saying the noise was just contractors working on the roof and to continue with our lessons. I called the office immediately and told the secretary we needed to go into lockdown, but Baxter grabbed the phone from her and hissed at me to stop being hysterical. He said if I scared the students or disrupted the school day over construction noise, he'd have me removed from the building and make sure my teaching license got reviewed by the board. 5 minutes later, we heard more pops, this time from the main hallway, followed by screaming that made my blood turn to ice. Baxter came back on the intercom insisting the drama class was rehearsing and everyone needed to remain calm and stay in their classrooms for instructional time. I looked at my 30 students staring at me with huge eyes, waiting for me to tell them what to do, and one girl in the front row whispered that her friend just texted that someone with a weapon was in the building. Baxter's voice crackled through again, saying any teacher who initiated lockdown procedures without his authorization would be terminated immediately and prosecuted for inciting panic. That's when I made the choice that probably saved our lives, but definitely ended my career. I told my students to help me barricade the door with every desk we could move, and while they were stacking furniture, I called 911 on my cell and whispered that we had an active threat at the high school and the principal was refusing to lock down. The dispatcher said units were already responding to multiple calls, and she told me to shelter in place immediately, which made me realize other teachers were defying Baxter too. We turned off the lights and huddled in the corner while I texted every teacher I had numbers for to barricade now, regardless of what Baxter said. Through the door's narrow window, I saw teachers running down the hallway with their students, and some were crying while others were carrying kids who'd frozen in fear. The intercom kept cutting in and out with Baxter's increasingly panicked voice, demanding everyone return to normal schedule. But then we heard glass breaking from the direction of the main office. His next announcement turned into a scream that cut off mid-sentence, and then the intercom went completely silent. My students were sobbing quietly in the corner while I stood between them and the door holding a baseball bat I'd found in the closet, trying to look brave when really I wanted to crawl under my desk and disappear. We could hear footsteps running past our room, and every time the doorknob rattled even slightly, 30 kids held their breath at once. The police sirens were getting closer, but they sounded so far away. One of my students showed me a text from her boyfriend saying someone was going room to room on the first floor trying door handles, and we were on the first floor. The smell of smoke started seeping under our door, and I realized something was burning nearby. My student asked if we should try to run for the exit, but I knew that leaving our barricaded room was probably S's side, so we stayed put while the smoke got thicker and the footsteps got closer. I heard doors slamming and more glass breaking, then this horrible laugh that didn't sound right, like someone who'd completely lost their mind. The footsteps stopped right outside our door, and the handle turned slowly, testing if it was locked, and then something slammed into it hard enough to make the whole frame shake. My students were pressing themselves against the back wall, trying to become invisible while I stood there with my stupid bat, knowing it wouldn't help at all. The door handle turned again, harder this time, and then we heard 3 loud bangs against the door that left holes letting in light from the hallway. Through those holes, I could see Baxter crawling down the hallway with blood on his shirt, trying to reach his office while looking over his shoulder at something we couldn't see yet. He was whimpering, and his perfect suit was torn, and when he saw me looking through the hole in my door, he mouthed the word help before something dragged him backward out of view. The footsteps came back to our door, and this time I could see a shadow through the holes moving slowly and deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. My students behind me were so quiet, I couldn't even hear them breathing, and I raised the bat knowing it was pointless, but needing to do something. The shadow paused right at our door, and through the hole, I saw an eye looking back at me, young and cold and absolutely empty, and I recognized him as a former student who Baxter had expelled last year after refusing to hear his side of a bullying incident. He smiled at me through that hole and raised something toward the door, and all I could think was that 30 kids were about to watch me die. The metal thing in his hand pointed straight at me through that hole, and I heard the trigger pull with this sick metallic click, but nothing happened. He pulled it again and again, each click making my knees shake harder, and then he just lowered it and stared at me for what felt like hours, but was probably 5 seconds. His face changed from that empty smile to something like confusion, and he turned away from our door and started walking down the hallway real slow, like he had nowhere else to be. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the bat anymore, and behind me, one of my students threw up into a trash can. From somewhere down the hall came shouting that made everyone jump, and I heard cops yelling, "Drop the weapon and get on the ground now." The commands kept repeating and getting louder, and my students started crying harder because we didn't know if this meant we were safe or if things were about to get worse. Some kids were sobbing with relief, while others pressed harder against the wall, and I stayed frozen at the door, trying to figure out what was happening through those bullet holes. My phone was still in my pocket, so I pulled it out and texted the 911 lady that cops were in the building, but we were staying put behind our barricade. She texted back immediately saying that was the right call, and officers would clear each room one by one, so don't move the desks yet. Through the holes, I could see shapes moving past our door, and these weren't regular cops, but guys in full tactical gear with shields and rifles. One of them stopped right at our door and looked through the hole at me, and he held up his badge and mouthed, "Stay there," while pointing at the ground. More officers moved past, and I heard them shouting clear after checking each room, and the smoke was getting so thick now that kids were coughing constantly. Brayden in the back was wheezing real bad and pumping her inhaler, but it wasn't helping much, and her face was turning this scary shade of gray. I knew opening the window was risky, but she needed air, so I crept over and cracked it just enough to let fresh air in without making too much noise. The cops kept moving through the building, and we could hear doors getting kicked in and more shouting, but at least the shooting had stopped completely. 20 minutes went by with us just sitting there breathing smoke and listening to police radios crackling in the hallway, and then 2 officers came back to our door. One of them said through the hole that they needed to verify we were the real class. So what was the phrase the dispatcher gave me? I told him she said to use the word pineapple juice, which sounded so stupid in that moment, but he nodded and said, "Okay, start moving the desks." My students got up on shaky legs and started pulling the furniture away from the door, and even though their hands were trembling, they worked together without me having to say anything. The officers were patient while we cleared the doorway, but then one looked at the smoke filling our room and said, "We're going out the window instead." He used his rifle butt to smash out the whole window, clearing all the glass from the frame while his partner kept watch on the hallway. They helped students climb through one at a time, lifting the smaller ones and supporting the ones whose legs were too shaky to climb alone. I made sure every kid got out before me, counting heads as they went through, and Sarah, who always sat in the back corner, was the last student to go. As she climbed through, she grabbed my hand and squeezed it, and I squeezed back, even though my whole arm was numb from holding that stupid bat for so long. The officer helped me through last, and as I put my leg over the windowsill, I looked back and saw the hallway through our open door. There were dark shapes on the floor that the cops had tried to block from our view with a portable screen, but I could still see feet sticking out and blood pooled on the white tiles. My stomach flipped, but I focused on getting through the window and following my students to the reunion area they'd set up in the parking lot. Parents were already arriving in waves, some running and screaming their kids' names, while others stood frozen like they couldn't process what was happening. I started counting my students again and again, getting 29 each time when I should have had 30. The quiet boy Marcus, who always sat in the back row, wasn't there, and panic shot through me until another student said Marcus went to the bathroom right before the first shots. A cop heard me asking about Marcus and got on his radio, and within minutes they confirmed they'd found him locked in a bathroom stall on the second floor, completely safe, but too scared to come out even for the police. Parents kept arriving and grabbing their kids, some crying and others just silent with this blank look like their brains had shut down to protect them. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. I stayed with the students whose parents hadn't gotten there yet, trying to look calm, while inside everything was falling apart, and I kept seeing that empty look in the shooter's eyes through the hole in my door. The paramedics rushed in 20 minutes later and went straight to Braden, who was still struggling to breathe normally. They put an oxygen mask on her face and checked her vitals while asking if her parents were here yet. Nobody had seen her mom arrive, so I told them I'd ride with her to the hospital. The paramedic helped her onto a stretcher, and I grabbed her hand, which was cold and shaking. In the ambulance, she kept squeezing my fingers every time we hit a bump, and I kept telling her she was safe now, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. The hospital emergency room was packed with kids from the school and their parents all talking at once. I helped get Braden settled in a room and stayed with her while nurses checked her over. That's when another teacher ran up to me with tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my shoulders and said they found the missing student from my class hiding in a supply closet on the 3rd floor. The kid was terrified but physically okay, and his parents were already with him. My legs went weak and I had to sit down right there in the hallway because I'd been sure that kid was dead. A detective in a cheap suit found me sitting on that hallway floor about an hour later. He introduced himself as Detective Bloom and asked if I could give him my statement about what happened. I told him everything I could remember, but the timeline was all mixed up in my head. I knew the shooter was Brendan Beckwith because I'd taught him 2 years ago before Principal Baxter expelled him. The detective wrote everything down and asked me to repeat certain parts, like exactly what Baxter said over the intercom. He seemed really interested in the part about Baxter threatening to fire anyone who went into lockdown. That evening I was back at my apartment watching the news when they confirmed Principal Baxter died from his injuries. 2 other staff members also died, including the secretary who'd tried to help me call for lockdown and a janitor who'd tried to stop Brendan near the main office. I felt sick thinking about Baxter crawling down that hallway begging for help. Part of me was furious at him for putting everyone in danger with his denial, but another part felt guilty that I couldn't save him. My phone rang around 10 that night, and it was Banks Boudreau, who taught history on the 2nd floor. She'd also ignored Baxter's orders and barricaded her classroom after hearing the first shots. We talked for an hour about what happened and agreed to back each other up if the district came after us for disobeying. She said she'd already heard rumors that the district was more worried about lawsuits than supporting the teachers who saved kids. The next morning, I woke up to an email from District Counsel Baker Beyer with the subject line, "Important Protocols and Procedures." The email was full of legal language about following proper channels and not speaking to media without district approval. It warned that any staff member who discussed the incident publicly could face disciplinary action. The tone made it clear they cared more about protecting themselves from lawsuits than about what we'd gone through. I spent that whole day writing down everything I could remember about the shooting. I typed out exact times and everything Baxter said over the intercom and what I saw through the holes in my door. My hands shook the entire time I was typing, but I knew this documentation might be important later if there were investigations or lawsuits. I included every detail I could think of, like which students helped move desks and who was texting updates from other parts of the building. The nightmares started that first night home. I woke up at 3 in the morning sure I'd heard those 3 pops again. My partner found me standing at our bedroom door holding a baseball bat and still half asleep. I'd been ready to fight someone who wasn't even there. there. The next few nights were the same, with me waking up in a panic thinking someone was trying to get into our room. 3 days after the shooting, an email came about planning memorial services for the victims. There was already fighting about whether Principal Baxter should be honored as a hero or held accountable for his denial that got people killed. Some teachers wanted to boycott any service that painted him as a victim when his actions made everything worse. I didn't know if I could face sitting through people calling him a hero when I kept seeing him threaten to fire me for trying to save my students. On day 4, I got an official letter placed on administrative leave pending investigation into procedural violations during the crisis response. The letter was signed by Baker Byer and used cold bureaucratic language about how I'd failed to follow district emergency protocols. They were investigating whether I'd acted appropriately by calling 911 without principal authorization and initiating unauthorized lockdown procedures. The letter said I wasn't allowed on the school property or to contact students or their families during the investigation. My phone buzzed with a text from Banks saying she got the same letter and we should start keeping track of everything that happened. She'd already asked for copies of the 911 calls and everything Principal said on the intercom using some government form. I was sitting at my kitchen table when Detective Bloom called to tell me Brendan had turned himself in at his parents' house. He said Brendan got kicked out last year after something happened where Principal wouldn't look at the security cameras that would have shown Brendan didn't do it. My phone started going crazy with messages from parents, some saying I saved their kids' lives and others posting online that I made things worse by not listening to Principal. One mom wrote a long Facebook post thanking me, while another dad commented that I should have followed the rules and maybe nobody would have gotten hurt. The back and forth between people loving me and hating me made my stomach hurt. Baker called me in for a meeting at the district office where she kept saying my actions caused kids to get hurt during the evacuation. I told her the 911 lady said to stay put, but she just kept talking about following the chain of command and respecting authority. Her office smelled like old coffee and she had this fake smile the whole time, like she was trying to be nice while basically calling me a bad teacher. 3 days later, I drove to the temporary school where they moved all the classes, just wanting to see my students and make sure they were okay. The security guard stopped me at the door and said I wasn't allowed near any students while I was on leave, walking me back to my car while other teachers stared through the windows. My face burned with shame as I fumbled with my keys, feeling like a criminal when all I did was try to save those kids. That night, the local news showed body camera footage from the cops where you could hear Principal on the intercom saying everything was fine while gunshots were going off in the background. People online started changing their minds about what happened, but the school district didn't say anything. Banks came over to my apartment and we spent hours putting together a timeline using our phone records, the 911 transcripts she got and screenshots of texts from students. We typed up everything that happened minute by minute, showing how Principal kept lying while we were trying to protect the kids. The next week, Detective Bloom called again, saying they were charging Brendan with a bunch of crimes, but it would take months or maybe even years for the trial. He sounded tired and said the system moves way too slow for something this serious. I decided to visit the memorial they set up outside the school, where people had left flowers and teddy bears and candles. Principal's picture was right in the middle with a sign calling him a hero who died protecting his students, and I just stood there feeling sick. People had written notes thanking him for his sacrifice and saying he was the best principal ever, but I was too tired to tell anyone what really happened. The truth didn't seem to matter when everyone wanted to believe something else. Baker called me back to her office the next day and slid a paper across her desk, saying if I quit quietly, they'd give me a neutral reference and drop the investigation. She said it would be better for everyone if this all just went away and I could find a teaching job somewhere else. The paper sat there between us while she tapped her pen on the desk, waiting for me to sign it. Part of me wanted to just take the deal and make all of this stop, but it felt wrong to let them pretend nothing bad happened. Those kids deserved better than everyone lying about what Principal did that day. I told Baker I needed time to think about it, and she said I had until the end of the week to decide. Walking out of her office, I saw other teachers in the hallway who used to be my friends, but now looked away when I passed. My phone had more messages from parents and reporters and lawyers, all wanting something from me. Banks texted that we should talk to a lawyer before I signed anything because the district was trying to cover their butts. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel, not knowing what to do next. 3 days later, Banks showed up at my apartment with a stack of papers and a determined look on her face. She pushed past me into my living room and spread everything out on my coffee table, pointing at different documents while explaining how she'd been collecting statements from other teachers. Her hands moved quickly as she sorted through witness accounts and photos from security cameras that somehow survived the fire. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. She told me she was ready to testify at any hearing about what really happened that day. I picked up one of the student statements and my stomach twisted when I saw how many kids were willing to relive that nightmare just to support us. We sat there for 2 hours going through everything while she kept insisting we had to fight back against the district's story. I kept thinking about those kids having to sit in a courtroom and describe the worst day of their lives all over again. Banks grabbed my shoulders and shook me slightly, saying we couldn't let them rewrite what happened to protect themselves. The papers scattered across my floor when I stood up too fast, and we both bent down to pick them up without talking. She left the documents with me and said to think about it, but her eyes already knew what I'd decide. I spent the next 3 weeks reading those statements over and over, each one making me angrier at how the district was handling everything. The kids described hearing the shots and watching me barricade the door while the principal kept lying over the intercom. Some wrote about the smoke and the fear and how they thought they were going to die in that corner. Others talked about seeing Baxter Baxter crawling in the hallway through the holes in our door. Every single one said they felt safer when I was ignored his orders and protected them instead. I finally called the school board office and told them I wanted to speak at the next public meeting. The secretary's voice got quiet when she recognized my name, and she said she'd add me to the agenda. I pulled out the 911 recording I'd gotten from my lawyer and played it 3 times, memorizing every word the dispatcher said about sheltering immediately. My hands weren't shaking anymore when I practiced reading my statement in front of the bathroom mirror. The night of the board meeting arrived, and the parking lot was already full an hour before it started. Parents stood in groups outside the building, some holding signs supporting teachers, while others had photos of Baxter. I walked through them with my head up, ignoring the whispers and stares from people I used to see at the school events. The meeting room was packed so tight that people stood along the walls and spilled into the hallway. I saw parents whose kids were in my class that day, sitting in the front row, their faces hard and angry. Behind them sat Baxter's wife and his adult kids, all wearing black and glaring at anyone who looked their way. The board members sat at their long table looking uncomfortable as the crowd got louder and more restless. When they called my name, I walked to the podium carrying my folder of evidence and the transcript from the 911 call. The room went completely silent as I pulled out my statement and smoothed it flat on the podium. I read each word clearly, starting with the timeline of when we heard the first shots and when Baxter made his announcements. I explained how I called the office and how he threatened my job if I initiated lockdown procedures. The crowd started murmuring when I played the 911 recording, where the dispatcher clearly ordered me to shelter in place immediately. I kept reading about how we barricaded the door and stayed hidden while Baxter continued lying over the intercom. Some parents were crying when I described seeing him crawl past our door with blood on his shirt. I finished by stating that I followed direct orders from emergency dispatch and protected 30 students who all survived. Baker Byer stood up from the board table and walked toward me with a stack of his own papers. He started asking about chain of command and whether I thought I knew better than the principal during a crisis. I pulled out the transcript and pointed to where the dispatcher gave me a direct order that superseded any school authority. He asked if I considered the panic I might have caused by defying the principal's assessment of the situation. I showed him the timeline proving other teachers were already calling 911 before I did. He kept trying to make me say I acted emotionally or that I overreacted to construction sounds. I stuck to the facts, reading directly from witness statements and the official police report. Every question felt like he was trying to make me slip up and admit I did something wrong. The crowd got louder each time he implied I should have listened to Baxter instead of protecting my students. After an hour of his questions, the board members huddled together at their table, whispering and passing notes. They finally announced they were issuing me a written reprimand for insubordination, but wouldn't terminate my teaching contract. My unpaid leave would continue while an external review board examined the entire incident. Half the room erupted in anger, while the other half clapped, and I just stood there feeling empty. 2 weeks later, Detective Bloom called and asked me to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. He looked tired when he told me Brendan had tried to kill himself in his cell 3 days earlier. The kid was on suicide watch now, and his lawyer was pushing for a mental health evaluation instead of prison. I stared at my coffee getting cold while he explained how Brendan's notebooks showed years of planning this attack. The detective said Brendan wrote about feeling invisible and wanting everyone to remember him forever. Part of me felt sick thinking about the quiet kid who used to sit in the back of my class writing stories. Another part wanted him to suffer for what he did to all those people. Bloom left after making me promise to call if I needed anything, but we both knew there was nothing he could do. The next morning, Braden's mom called and asked if I wanted to get coffee with her and Braden. We met at a small place across town where nobody would recognize us. Braden looked thinner and older somehow, her hands wrapped tight around her cup. Her mom thanked me 3 times before I could even sit down, tears running down her face. Braden told me about the therapy group she'd joined with other kids from our class. She said they met twice a week and mostly just sat together without talking much. Nobody mentioned that day directly, but we all knew why we were there. They stayed for an hour and hugged me before leaving, and none of us said goodbye. A month later, the district finally let me pack up my classroom with a security officer watching everything I did. My hands started shaking the second I walked through the door and saw everything exactly how we'd left it. The desks were still piled against the door, and the baseball bat lay in the corner where I'd dropped it. I picked it up, and my whole body started trembling so hard I had to sit down. The security officer looked at the wall and pretended not to notice me crying. I packed my personal items into boxes while stepping around the dark stains on the carpet that nobody had cleaned. When I got home that night, I found my car covered in folded notes tucked under the windshield wipers. Some thanked me for saving their friends, while others blamed me for not saving Baxter. One just said their favorite principal was dead because teachers like me thought we knew everything. I sat in my driveway reading each one, understanding there would never be a story that made everyone feel better. The truth was messy and painful and different depending on where you stood when it happened. 2 months passed before the district finally called me back. The woman on the phone kept her voice flat while explaining they had a position at the Alternative Education Center if I was interested. The pay was $12,000 less than my old salary, and the benefits package was worse, but at least it meant I could keep my apartment and buy groceries. I drove to the building the next morning and noticed the metal detectors right inside the front door, along with 2 security guards checking bags. The principal walked me through hallways that felt more like a minimum security prison than a school with cameras in every corner and locks that required key cards. He kept saying they took safety very seriously here and pointing out all the security features like he was trying to sell me a car. The classrooms had panic buttons next to the whiteboards and reinforced doors that locked from the inside. Every window window had wire mesh over it and the desks were bolted to the floor so nobody could throw them. I nodded at everything he showed me while my hands stayed clenched in my pockets. The other teachers I met had this tired look in their eyes like they'd been through their own battles. One of them pulled me aside and told me most of the kids here had been kicked out of regular schools for fighting or drugs or bringing weapons. She said it wasn't as bad as it looked once you got used to it. I spent 3 days thinking about whether I could handle being in classrooms again before finally calling to accept the position. My bank account was getting close to empty, and pride doesn't pay rent. 3 months after the shooting, I walked into my new classroom for the first time carrying a box of supplies I'd bought with my own money since the school budget was basically nothing. The kids looked at me like fresh meat until I started teaching, and they realized I actually knew my stuff. Everything went okay until the monthly lockdown drill when the alarm started blaring and I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. My hands shook so bad I couldn't turn the lock on the stall door. Banks texted me that afternoon from her new job at a school across town asking how my first day went, and I lied and said it was fine. The state investigation report came out that same week in a document so full of legal language it took me hours to read through it. They mentioned delayed lockdown procedures and communication failures and inadequate crisis response protocols, but my name wasn't anywhere in the whole thing. The report made it sound like everything just happened without anybody making actual decisions. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. They recommended better training and clearer policies and more frequent drills, but nothing that would bring back the people who died. Brendan's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the next month, and I got subpoenaed to testify as a witness. Walking into that courtroom and seeing him sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit made my chest feel like it was crushed. He looked smaller than I remembered, and younger too, with his lawyer whispering in his ear. When he turned and saw me, his face didn't change at all, like I was just another stranger in the room. The prosecutor asked me questions for 2 hours about what I saw and heard that day, while Brendan stared at the table. His lawyer kept objecting to things, and the judge kept overruling, and the whole time I felt both furious at what he'd done and weirdly sorry for him sitting there alone. That night, I opened my laptop and started typing an email to Baxter's widow, trying to explain how sorry I was about everything. I wrote 5 different versions, but none of them felt right, because what do you say to someone whose husband died after making the worst possible choice? The cursor just blinked at me while I stared at words that couldn't fix anything. I never sent any of those emails, and eventually I stopped trying. The baseball bat from that day ended up in my trunk, where it rolled around every time I turned a corner. Sometimes I'd forget it was there for weeks, and then I'd hear it thunk against something and remember everything all over again. Other times I'd check to make sure it was still there, like some kind of security blanket I couldn't let go of. 4th of July came 5 months after the shooting, and I made the mistake of going to watch fireworks at the park. The first boom sent me diving behind a bench while families stared at me like I was crazy. My whole body shook, and I couldn't breathe right until I got back to my car and locked all the doors. Later that night, one of my old students sent me a grammar meme about comma splices, and I actually laughed for the first time in months. I sent back a joke about dangling modifiers, and for just a second, things felt almost normal. Banks called me the next week, asking if I wanted to join a support group she was starting for teachers who'd been through trauma. She'd rented out her living room to 5 other teachers from different schools who'd dealt with violence in their classrooms. We met every month to sit in a circle and talk about the nightmares and the panic attacks and the way loud noises made us jump. Nobody tried to make it mean something or find a silver lining, because sometimes terrible things just happen, and the only thing you can do is keep going. 2 weeks after that meeting, my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone I didn't recognize at first. The profile picture showed a young woman with dark hair pulled back, and when I clicked on it, I realized it was one of my students from that day, all grown up now and working at a bank downtown. She wrote that she'd been looking for me for months and just wanted to say thanks for keeping them safe, and I stared at that message for 20 minutes before typing back that I was glad she was doing okay. More messages started coming after that. Former students finding me through social media and sending careful notes about their lives now, how they were in college or working or raising kids of their own, and every message had this weight to it, like we were all carrying pieces of that day around with us. I'd started teaching again at an alternative school across town, one of those places where kids go when regular school doesn't work out, and at first nobody knew who I was or what had happened at my old school. The pay was terrible, and the building was old, and half the kids showed up high, but at least I was back in a classroom doing what I knew how to do. Word got around though, the way it always does, and within a month the other teachers were looking at me different, and the kids were whispering when I walked by. Some of them thought I was this big hero for standing up to the principal. Others figured I was just another adult who couldn't follow rules, and the truth was somewhere in between, but I didn't bother explaining myself to anyone. Then one afternoon my phone rang with a number I didn't know, and when I answered, a woman's voice said she was calling from a law office representing Brendan, and they needed to talk to me about being a character witness. She explained how Brendan had been my student before the expulsion, how I'd known him when he was just a regular kid, and maybe I could help the jury understand that he wasn't always like this. I told her no before she even finished talking, because I couldn't sit in a courtroom and talk about the kid who used to write poetry in my class when 30 other kids were still having nightmares about what he did. She called back 3 more times over the next few weeks, leaving messages about how my testimony could make a difference, but I deleted everyone without listening all the way through. 6 months had passed since that day, and I was teaching full-time again at the alternative school, making half what I used to make, and seeing a therapist every Wednesday who kept telling me healing wasn't linear. The little orange pill bottles in my medicine cabinet helped with the panic attacks, and most days I could get through classes without my hands shaking, though loud noises still made me drop whatever I was holding. My new students didn't care much about Shakespeare or grammar, but they showed up most days, and that was enough for now. A teacher from my old school emailed asking for advice because she'd just started there and heard I knew about classroom safety, and I sent her a list of practical stuff like keeping the door locked and having a code word with neighboring teachers, but I couldn't write about the deeper stuff, the way you never really stop listening for footsteps in the hallway. The district called a big meeting about new emergency protocols they were rolling out, with color-coded flip charts and acronyms that were supposed to make everyone feel safer, and I saw Banks there representing the union. We sat through 2 hours of presentations about response matrices and threat assessment teams, and when they asked for questions, Banks and I just looked at each other because we both knew you can't fix a broken culture with fancy charts. Nobody mentioned principal's name or talked about how he'd ignored the warnings. They just kept saying words like comprehensive and proactive, like that would somehow erase what happened. Braden's mom sent me a message with a picture attached, and when I opened it, there was Braden in a cap and gown, graduating 6 months early through some accelerated program for kids who'd been through trauma. Her smile looked real enough in the photo, but her eyes had this look I recognized from the mirror, like she was always watching for something bad to happen. The anniversary came up faster than I expected, a whole year since that morning when everything changed, and the school district planned this big memorial service with speeches and a moment of silence. I couldn't make myself go, couldn't sit there listening to people talk about healing and moving forward when some of us were still stuck in that day. Instead, I drove to a different school across town and parked outside during recess, watching kids run around on the playground screaming and laughing like kids are supposed to, and I tried to remember when that noise didn't make me nervous. My partner found me there an hour later after I didn't answer my phone, and they just sat with me in the car without asking questions, because they'd learned when I needed space and when I needed someone close. We'd been through the worst parts together, the nightmares and the medication adjustments, and the times I couldn't leave the house, and somehow we were stronger now, even though we barely talked about that day anymore. The news kept running updates about Brendan's case, how his lawyers kept filing motions, and the trial date kept getting pushed back, and every delay felt like another weight added to this thing we were all carrying around. 3 weeks later, I was pushing my cart through the frozen food section when someone called my name, and I turned to see one of my former students with her mom by the ice cream. The girl smiled and told me she got into state for pre-med, and her mom squeezed her shoulder while we talked about dorm assignments and freshman orientation. Neither of them mentioned why I wasn't at the high school anymore, and I didn't bring it up either, because some things don't need to be said out loud. The girl hugged me before they left and whispered thanks for everything, and I stood there holding a bag of frozen peas for way too long after they walked away. That night, my therapist pointed at my chart and showed me I'd gone 6 nights without waking up screaming, which she called real progress. I nodded and took the prescription refill she handed me and tried not to think about how progress meant sleeping through the night instead of teaching full-time. The alternative school where I work now had smaller classes and more security, and kids who needed extra help for different reasons. One mom stopped me after pickup and grabbed my hand to thank me for being patient with her son who had behavior problems. She didn't know about my past, and I didn't tell her because I was just trying to be a decent teacher one day at a time. Her son had started turning in homework and participating in class discussions, which felt like winning the lottery compared to where he'd been 2 months ago. Banks called that weekend to tell me she got promoted to assistant principal at her new school across town. We met up in her empty classroom with Chinese takeout and plastic forks and joked about how she'd be the one making announcements now. She showed me her new office keys, and we both laughed when she practiced her serious administrator voice over lo mein. The bat I'd kept in my trunk for months finally made it to my garage when I cleaned out my car for an oil change. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. I carried it past my toolbox and lawnmower and set it in the corner where it stayed for another month before I moved it again. One day I climbed into the attic to get Christmas decorations and brought the bat up with me and put it in a box marked old stuff behind the artificial tree. I wasn't ready to throw it away, but I didn't need it close anymore, which my therapist said was its own kind of progress. The local news announced that Brendan had decided to plead guilty to avoid trial, which meant 40 years with possibility of parole after 25. Some people online said it was too harsh for a kid who'd been bullied, and others said he should have gotten life without parole. I thought about the boy who used to write poetry in my sophomore class and turn in extra credit and smile when he got his papers back with good grades. The alternative school had different rules and procedures, and my new students noticed I was strict about them from day one. One kid asked why we had to practice lockdown drills every week when other teachers only did them monthly. I told him structure helps everyone feel safe, which was true enough, without explaining the whole truth about why I needed that structure too. He shrugged and went back to his worksheet while I checked the door locks for the 3rd time that period without him noticing. Today, I taught a lesson on metaphors using examples from song lyrics and sports, which always got the kids engaged and participating. Someone dropped their textbook and it hit the floor with a bang that echoed through the room, but nobody froze or ducked under their desks. I didn't run to the door or grab the closest heavy object or feel my heart trying to escape from my chest. I just kept teaching about how metaphors compare two unlike things and watched my students take notes and ask questions like it was any other Tuesday. The bell rang and they packed up their stuff and filed out talking about lunch and homework and weekend plans while I erased the board. I made it through the whole lesson without checking the door once, which was enough victory for now. Interesting conversation happening here. Makes you wonder what they're really thinking underneath it all. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.